Please welcome our panelists, Chief Executive Officer of Development Reimagined, Hannah Ryder, Chief Executive Officer of the African Wildlife Foundation, Kaddu Sebunya, Chief Heat Officer of Freetown in Sierra Leone, Eugenia Kargbo, and our moderator, reporter at Bloomberg News, Antony Sguazzin.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. So we're going to be discussing adaptation and mitigation in Africa. And just looking at the last few years, it's been a fairly traumatic time for parts of Africa in terms of climate change. We've seen cyclones in Southeast Africa, devastating Malawi, Mozambique, parts of Zimbabwe and South Africa. We've seen floods from Durban in South Africa, Rwanda and Uganda in East Africa, and across West Africa. And we've seen the worst drought in 4 decades in the Horn of Africa. It's obvious that we're seeing much more adverse weather events, and we need to plan for those and prepare and mitigate their impact. So in this session, what we'd like to discuss is what the balance should be, what we can do, what we should expect in terms of finance, and what we should also expect from COP, which is coming up in late November this year. We will take audience questions. There should be a QR code up quite soon. Just enter your questions. I should be able to see it here on the iPad, and I'll convey those to the panelists. So without any further ado, let's get going. And basically, I'm going to kick off with Hannah. Can you just speak a little bit about what we saw at COP last year? We saw the announcement of a loss and damage fund. It was a big step, got a lot of recognition. But given that we had an agreement many years ago in Copenhagen that industrialized countries would provide $100 billion of climate finance every year to developing nations, and that's never happened. Can we really expect to see anything happen this time around?
Good and a very big question. 2009, Copenhagen was I was one of the climate finance negotiators involved in not only negotiating that 100 billion, but also for my sins as an economist, being somebody who was working on the numbers, where that 100 billion came from. And at the time, it was a kind of, in a sense, almost a hopeful time, although Copenhagen itself was a really difficult negotiation, because there was a willingness on the part of developed countries to say they would actually put up some of the cost for dealing with adaptation and mitigation in poorer countries. And that was a new position. There'd been nothing like that before. In the past, it was all these, small by small, bit by bit contributions to the GEF, all these different funds that were in existence. But unfortunately, however well that 100 billion itself was crafted based on the analysis at that time, we haven't seen, as you said, that money come forward. Now, what's different about the loss and damage negotiation coming up to now is that it has been the push has been from developing countries for it to be a fund agreement as opposed to an overall pledge of money. Because I think the trust in overall pledges of money has really just completely decimated. The idea that, you make a pledge and then somehow, countries will cobble money together, etc., it's just not strong enough. There are existing funds. The Green Climate Fund was also agreed in 2009 and came into being soon thereafter. And again, that hasn't had enough finance. So it's a good kind of. There's a really big question as to where that money actually comes from, even if a fund is created. So there's a lot of work still going on that developing countries, African countries, still need to do to work to decide what are the actual mechanisms, financial mechanisms that would be drawn on to put into a fund like that. And that will be the next step for agreement.
Right. If I can just quickly follow up with you before we go to our other panelists. The onus has always been put on the traditionally industrialized nations. That's Western nations, basically the US, and the big European, Western European powers. But two of the big polluters now are India and China. And I know it's quite contentious, and there's been a lot of pushback on this, but should they also be contributing?
It is a contentious topic because in the UN setting, there's this kind of division. I hate using these terms, developed and developing, and I know I just said it several times. And I usually use, and in my firm, we normally use high income and low and middle income countries. But in the UN climate negotiations, there is this very clear division. And China and India fit into the developing section. But on the other hand, the interpretation that has been is that China and India, for instance, and other emerging economies, middle-income countries, will be able to contribute as they develop.
Right.
It's not that they are required to by international law, and that's the contentious part. Now, you do see Chinese companies, for instance, and you see China Exim Bank financing green projects across the world, not only on the African continent, but also in Asia, right. Whether that's energy, transport, etc. You do see that. And in many ways, the Chinese government counts that, for instance, as their contribution right. to support. Of course, there's even more that can be done, but at the end of the day, it's really about what is required by international law, and the view that is from developing countries, at least lower middle income countries, that the legal requirement should be on the high-income countries, the countries that have been emitting right. for a long time.
Okay, just turning to you, Kaddu. What does climate change look like in Africa? What are the impacts you're seeing? And your organization, you must have some insight into the impacts on biodiversity. Perhaps you could just speak about that for a little while.
No, thank you. Climate discussions is different at different levels, and we work in the rural Africa, which is the remotest parts of Africa, but also we work at national and global levels. So that conversation is different in different aspects. The impact is the same. We've seen increased droughts, increased flooding. As we speak now, there's flooding in parts of Eastern Africa. Mm-hmm. A month ago, it was drought. And economies of rural folks were wiped out because of a drought East Africa has had for the last 4 years. Rainfall is unpredictable, so nobody knows when to grow anything mm-hmm. and what's expected. And these are 80% of the people are relying on agriculture as their livelihood. So it's critical that the investments help in addressing some of this climate change. But back to your previous question, it's really what the financing mechanisms being discussed at COP or any other global meeting. We don't see that at the ground.
Right.
So a mechanism that can deliver financing at the ground is what's going to address climate change, because many of the solutions are part of what things people do every day. It's things households do to pay their health charges or pay school fees or buy food, and what are going to determine the solutions of climate change. We've seen it in the loss of biodiversity. Mm-hmm. The biggest challenge on biodiversity is loss of habitats through climate change and human activities. The biggest human activity that is affecting biodiversity is agriculture, expansive agriculture. That is practice that's being carried out due to climate change issues, mostly driven by climate change, but also food security for majority of people. So biodiversity, we know, is a big part of the solution to climate change. We need to secure the anchors of biodiversity, which is mostly protected areas. And Africa has come up with a plan to secure these anchors on sustainable financing. They've come up with a Pan-African Sustainable Financing Trust that Africa has suggested to anchor some of these things, in addition to what is being negotiated at the global stage.
All right, great. Eugenia, perhaps I can turn to you. You're the Chief Heat Officer for Freetown. Can you just explain what that job involves and why it's necessary?
And good morning, everybody. Building on what Mr. Kaddu said, climate change is affecting the warm cities in different ways, and extreme heat is one of the major climate risks that cities are facing. the land data temperature of Freetown shows that over the past 20 years, temperatures in Freetown has been rising at an exponential rate, causing a lot of challenges on the economy, on health, and on the environment. And in as much as everyone in Freetown is exposed to extreme heat, there are certain population groups and people that are most vulnerable. People working in the informal sector, people living in the informal settlements, which account for 35% of the city's population. So in preparing for heat events and to ensure that we have plans, the city of Freetown has a partnership with the Ashbrook Resilience Center in a drive to build community resilience and to ensure that we prepare. So in my role as the Chief Heat Officer, I have been working closely with the municipality to identify and implement locally led solutions to help the most vulnerable of the society adapt to extreme heat.
Okay. Perhaps just following up on that, could you just briefly explain to us what lessons other cities might learn from what you've done so far?
And in as much as there are several challenges that we face in terms of extreme heat, as the population of Freetown grows, the city expands. And looking at the geographical landscape of Freetown, Freetown is located between steep hills, mountains, and the sea. So as the city expands, it expands into the forest areas and into the coastal areas. So we've witnessed massive deforestation and degradation of the hillsides and the coastal lines, exacerbating several climate issues such as floods and coastal erosion and extreme heat. And the build-up environment also in Freetown is a major problem. 90% of our infrastructure is built from cement. So you have a lot of pavement. As the population grows, natural land cover is replaced with green spaces. The informal settlement, housing within the informal settlements are also a challenge, as most of the houses in the informal settlement are built from corrugated iron sheets, and these are heat-trapping materials. So a lot of residents suffer from heat exposure outdoor, but also suffer from indoor exposure. And women are the most vulnerable, as they occupy 55% of the informal working community, and most of them are traders. And because of all the issues with infrastructure and resources to provide the needed infrastructure for the city, we have also seen a lot of open air markets. So a lot of these women are trading in the street without any structure or shade cover. So what we have done is to try to understand what this means for Freetown and where are the most vulnerable communities. So this year, January, in partnership with the Ashbrook Resilience Center and the NOAA Institute in the US, we conducted the first ever heat mapping assessment for Freetown. And we have the results now, which we are building on to really understand where are the hotspots in Freetown. But the data shows us that everywhere in Freetown is getting hotter, but there are specific communities that stay hotter throughout the day. It also shows that we have a major problem in terms of air quality and air pollution, and the combination of heat and air pollution is a deadly mix. And so we have been working with communities, looking at how we design signs, we co-design plans, and implement sustainable solutions to ensure that we reduce extreme heat. We are planting trees. The target is to plant 1 million trees and increase the vegetation cover to reduce some of the climate vulnerabilities that we are exposed to.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that we need to spend more money and have better plans for adaptation, adapting to what the new reality is, that climate change is happening, will continue to happen. But we had a panel yesterday where we spoke about clean energy, which is mitigation, and there's not that much money going into that either. A lot of enthusiasm and plans, but I spoke to the president of IFAD quite recently, and he estimated that for every dollar that goes into adaptation, you're seeing $12 go into mitigation. So there's very little money going into adaptation. How do we change that split? Perhaps, Hannah, you could speak to that.
Well, I do think there should be more money for adaptation and more money for mitigation. I don't think it's a question of spending less on mitigation for adaptation. I think one of the issues with mitigation, I think it's really not well understood, and I want to kind of link into what was also said yesterday about, where is the African continent going, not just in terms of people, but in terms of contribution to the global economy.
Sure.
And we're talking about a continent which is meant to be the world's next manufacturing hub after China. That's what Secretary General Wamkele Mene was saying. If that's the case, there is, of course, you're going to have significant industrialization, potentially of the scale of China or more. Now, if you had that, then you would have to put a great deal more, so much more money than is expected, even now, needs to go into mitigation. And I think that's often really misunderstood because we're constantly talking as Africans about, and it's very important. I don't think it's not important. Constantly talking about people who have lack of access to energy, lack of access to, kind of support for trade and so on. But fundamentally, we also have to envision a continent that is at a completely different scale. And if the continent is at that completely different scale, then the mitigation funds need to be there. And the mitigation funds can come through. That's what the just transition in many ways is all about. It's about making sure that governments have the finance and the leeway, the flexibility to put into place energy from all sorts of sources to power that industrialization. But of course, the vast majority of African governments as well are very committed to low carbon. 99% of African governments have submitted NDCs to the UN. They've fulfilled their international commitments. 25% of African countries have got a zero carbon goal, and many other countries don't. High-income countries don't. So, there's leadership, but it needs to be matched at the international level through increased investment and financing.
Kaddu, perhaps I can ask you, there's a lot of talk about money coming in from outside Africa. We're not seeing it come in. What can we do ourselves?
There are a lot of things we can do. I think it's how we show up, first of all, at this global stage. We cannot continue showing up as victims, like Hannah just said. We are really part of the solution to the global challenges, especially around climate change. We have the largest land for the whole world. That's the Congo Basin. It absorbs carbon more than any forestry cover in the world, including Amazon. Protecting that land for the world requires financing. And we need to have a serious conversation with the rest of the world, what it entails, the cost Africa is incurring for protecting and conserving the land for the rest of the world. There is an offset to that. That's where the negotiations are to be. But with the mitigation and adaptation, we cannot continue to show up and as if we are asking for aid. No. Aid doesn't work. We require investments in adaptation and mitigation on the continent. So we need to do some work in how we show up and what we are asking for the rest of the world and the role the rest of the world needs to play. But we need to also to do some work ourselves in creating the environment for the investments in our countries. We talked about policies. We talked about incentives we need to offer. We talked about the data we need to correct on what our resources. We need those data sets in order to have a better negotiation with the rest of the world. But most importantly, we need to get our people, the mindsets, to where they need to be. We talked a lot about infrastructure for the last 1.5 days, but I didn't hear anything about the ecological infrastructure Africa needs for our development.
What do you mean by ecological infrastructure?
Ecological infrastructure is the ecological systems, for example, that we need for our agriculture. We know agriculture is rain-fed. or even if you are doing irrigation, that water comes from somewhere. So what are the systems, ecological systems, that sustain and puts us in a comparative advantage for agriculture?
So we need to do more to protect
We
our
need to
existing
do more to
systems.
conserve and protect. Our natural resources are assets. We shouldn't look at them as extraction alone, but we need to use them, invest in them, how we utilize them sustainably, because that is our comparative advantage. That is the ecological infrastructure we need to invest in, but also invite others to do. But we need to play our role ourselves.
Right.
Can I add a little bit to that in terms of showing up? Because, again, I think a lot of the time, you know, as Africans, we're often ready to do more. We're, you know, ready to say we need to do more, etc. I think that's fine, and we definitely do. But we also, I think there's a significant issue around, for example, if we're talking about carbon markets are not just created by us doing more to create the market. They're created, it's not just a supply question, it's a demand question. And that demand question is about what's Europe doing, what's America doing, what's China doing, what's India doing. And I think one of the key issues for our negotiators, especially, but our governments in general, is what is our foreign policy positions on these countries, and becoming a lot more savvy about what are those countries doing, because it matters. That's why we're continuing to pay adaptation costs, because there has been continuous environmental degradation and continuous use of high emissions. So when, you know, Europe starts to use more coal because of the issues with Russia, that's not just a European question, it's an African question, because it has an immediate, well, it will have an impact on adaptation. And I think we need to start looking at that. So not only framing it as a solution, you know, President Ruto, my president, talks a lot about the African continent being a continent of solutions, and I think that's right. But we also have to become even stronger demanders from the rest of the world of what we need from them, because we face the cost.
Right. And I was speaking to the head of the AFC Capital Partners yesterday, and they were saying that Africa has a lot to offer the world in terms of counteracting climate change. You spoke about carbon sinks. So really, Eugenia, I wanted to ask you, in your country, what can you do to counteract climate change, and what do you have to offer?
There's a lot that we have been doing. In January this year, we launched the first climate action plan, and that looks at what can we do to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And we also did a greenhouse gas inventory data, which is very important, which shows us where our emissions are coming from. And so we've been working with partners and the government to ensure that we develop sustainable plans and to ensure that we also have the resources to deliver on those plans. And this is why the issue and discussions around adaptation financing is also very important. At the community level and at the people level, we have plans, we understand the issues, and what we're doing is at a very small scale. We need to scale that up to have the maximum impact that we need to make the difference. We started with planting 1 million trees in vulnerable areas to ensure that we are stabilizing destabilized slopes, we are protecting coastal communities, and we are working towards putting a tree out for investment in the register and looking out for opportunities for carbon offset. But definitely there are agreements and policies that countries and richer countries have signed up to, and I think that it is very necessary and important for them to meet their commitments. Only 21% of adaptation finance is available, of climate international finance is available for adaptation finance. And so we need to ensure that there is more money to do what is needed in low-income countries. Already we are battling with education and providing health. And so this is another burden. So we need to ensure that those that can afford, are bringing along countries that do not have the might to reach the ultimate goal.
Great. So just on that point, turning to the big climate summit at the end of the year, COP in Dubai. Hannah, you used to be a climate negotiator. You know that that's a very complex, a very fraught negotiations. What do you think the lower income countries should be demanding this year?
I think it's absolutely in terms of more action, and to become very specific about that action, specific countries, specific regions. It is also more finance, of course, and not just pledges of finance, learning lessons from what has been done, seeking finance into specific funds and for specific issues. There are the funds, there's the Green Climate Fund, there's the Adaptation Fund, there are many other localized national banks and so on who are doing all of this work, getting specific commitments to that as well. And of course, as you were mentioning at the beginning, the progress on loss and damage. There will be, no doubt, many calls for some specific mechanisms for loss and damage, which is now a reality because there's irrefutable shift. So there will be that. I think where the hope might come, and I think, there is so much collaboration that is happening, especially around, we were talking just earlier about green technology, there was a discussion on green hydrogen. I would hope that some of that kind of appetite for change could actually infuse the negotiations a bit more. It's very difficult as a negotiator for that to happen, though. Sure. You're always so far away from what's really happening, and so much in your kind of own policy box. But I hope some of that will come through, and including, I think, on this issue of environmental goods, there is an opportunity, but also a risk for African countries about being left behind on the environmental goods arena. And so again, there's an opportunity there for the continent to say, look, this is what we really want, not just access, we also want to be the ones who are producing.
Right, so we just got a couple of minutes left. I think staying on COP, perhaps Kaddu and Eugenia, perhaps you could just quickly say what you would like the world to do this year.
Yeah, I really want to see Africa show up differently. I think that the best way to do is to show up with shovel-ready projects. We need to be identifying the programs of actions we would like to do in Africa and the role we are playing, and define the role of the rest. That's what our negotiation is about. Historically, we've been negotiating based on what is on the table. This time we should show up with ideas we have developed, but show up also bravely that we have elements that the world wants. We have 30% of the global biodiversity. We have a third of the freshwater lakes. We have, I've just heard, about 15 or 20% of the minerals that the world needs to adopt. What are we doing? What projects are in the pipelines? What investments do we need? What are we doing ourselves to do that? What timescales? How much amount of money do we need? And what private sector can do to do that? We should get away from idea that other countries are going to come and invest and help us survive climate change. But we should be able to go and talk to financiers, people who are looking for profit, but impactfully, and have a negotiation on how they need to do this. They are there on many of these conferences, but we pay more attention, I think, to bilateral discussions. I would like to see that change.
All right. Eugenia, perhaps we just end with you. Could you tell us what you're expecting this year, or what you would want from the conference?
So I do agree with all what has been said. I think we should show up with the background that we do understand the problem, and with the background that we are doing work. And there is a lot that can be done with little available resources, but also we should show up and have an engagement to see how we can unlock climate adaptation finance for African cities.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much to my panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.